Good morning, church family. It's wonderful to have you back here again this morning. Thank you for tuning in to our live stream service here at Toowoomba Central. And we pray that you are well from wherever you are this morning. Just a quick announcement, just another one. Thank you, John, for our elder on duty today. If you were viewing last Sabbath, our church service last week, you would have noticed that there was an interruption in our program. And I was just notified this morning that there was a technical issue across the country. It looks like the coronavirus got into the computers and everything else. But there was a technical issue across it wasn't just us, there were a whole lot of other churches who also, their program was also interrupted. So we're very sorry that your viewing would have been interrupted last Sabbath, but our live stream team did a wonderful job, and I just want to thank them. Tabitha, Julian, Sam, they were here last Sabbath, and they got some great coaches in Laszlo and Clinton, and they were able to continue the rest of our program from last Sabbath. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. This week, I wanted to continue. This is part 2 from last Sabbath. And this morning is when you're down to nothing, pray. When you're down to nothing, pray. And this is, we get this from the story. This is part 2 of our encounter and this remarkable story of Hannah and prayer. And I was really excited to hear the great discussion on our Sabbath school lesson, which they discuss quite in depth on intercessory prayer. And if I wonder if they can catch that if you didn't see that this morning. But just a reminder, we have our Sabbath school every Sabbath morning who do a wonderful job and really breaking down the word of life. And this morning was some wonderful content, biblical content on prayer, intercessory prayer. And today part 2 of Hannah, but in particular the prayer of Hannah. The prayer of Hannah this morning. Now you probably read this many times, and just a quick brief was Hannah comes onto the scene around in the book of Judges, and chronologically Hannah's in around Judges chapter 10. That the story of Hannah comes on that Hannah comes onto the scene in Bible history, when in fact. Hannah's not until the book of 1 Samuel. So you have Judges, Ruth, and Samuel. And Hannah backs onto the background of the book of Judges. And if you're aware of the book of Judges, the book of Judges is probably one of the most darkest times in the history of Israel. So I'm not going to repeat myself, because I spent quite a bit of time last week describing this time in the book of Judges. And it was actually a time when Israel, there's probably many times, but this is what I see as probably one of the most darkest, one of the most terrible times in Israel's history, when they had turned away from God. And one of the big problems was that God was not the central figure in this time of Israel's history. In fact, at the end of the book of Judges, it finishes with these words: there was no king in Israel, and these words are worse. Right at the end of the book of Judges, it says these words: each one did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king. They were not accepting. It seemed like the people of the time were not willing to take any authority from God, and they all did what was right in their own eyes. And what a terrible time it was. And so Hannah comes onto the scene. Ruth is the other one, which I think we'll touch on. I'll touch on next. But Hannah comes onto this scene, and there was a one in particular to look at the prayer of Hannah. Pastor Tony Campolo tells a story, and Pastor Tony Campolo is a pastor over in the States, in America, and some time back he shared this story. It's on prayer, and Tony preaches at a church, so he's invited to preach at a church. So he turns up to this church, and as this church normally does, the elders will take the preacher back into the elders' room, and they will pray for the preacher before the preacher comes out and preaches. And so Tony says the elders took him to the back, and this church, they just love to pray. They took him to the back room, and the elders huddled together. They put Tony in the middle, and all the elders had put their hands on Tony, and they started praying for him. And Tony says that the prayers were long, and the longer the prayers went, their arms were heavy on Tony. And he said there was one elder in particular, he wasn't even praying about Tony. He wasn't praying about the church service. One particular elder was praying about his friend whose name was Charles. And Tony says, and this elder had his hand on me and starts praying about his friend Charles. And this elder says, Lord, I pray for Charles. He's just left his wife. He lives in the caravan park down the road. He's walking out of his marriage this morning. Lord, I pray you bring them back together, and so on. And then Tony says that after the prayer time with the elders, he preaches a sermon. After his sermon, he's driving home. And as Tony's driving home, he spots this gentleman hitchhiking on the side of the road. And Tony pulls over and he says, hop in, I'll take you wherever you need to go. And the first question that Tony asks this gentleman is, what's your name? And this gentleman says, oh, my name's Charles. And straight away Tony says, your name's Charles. Your last name is Charles Stewart, isn't it? And Charles is now blown away. He's sitting there going, how did you know? And then Tony says, Charles, you've left your wife, haven't you? And Charles now he's shocked. And then Tony says, Charles, you live up in that caravan park, don't you? And then Tony says to Charles, we're going to turn this car around right now. We're going to go back to that caravan park. We're going to talk to your wife, and we're going to bring you back together again. Today, well, at the time, Charles came back together with his wife, and Charles became a pastor in their church, all because there was a church who were dedicated to pray. There was a church that loved to pray. And I thought I'd use that story because Hannah's prayer, and we find this in the book of 1 Samuel, Hannah's prayer changed everything. Hannah's prayer changed everything. And so last week in part 1, we looked at Hannah's pain. So I won't rehash that again. We looked at Hannah's, where Hannah decided to focus her worship. And remember, Hannah comes onto the scene when everyone is doing what was right in their own eyes. And Hannah is being now very counter-cultural. She's doing what everyone else is not doing. Everyone's doing what they like, what they want. It was a time of humanism, a time of existentialism, a time of, enlightenment, and everyone's focusing now on how they feel and how they think. Does that sound like our times today? And then Hannah comes onto the scene and she flips the script. And not only does she focus her worship not on herself, but totally on God. And also, and then Hannah makes a promise. I won't rehash all that again, but we'll now look at more about Hannah's prayer. And in verse 5 and 6 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, so Verse 5 and 6, and Samuel chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, says these words. And the Lord closed her womb. The Lord had closed, and the Lord closed her womb because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. In fact, from verse 1 down to verses 7, Hannah is silent. She's quiet. She hasn't come onto the picture yet. She hasn't said anything yet. She hasn't taken an action yet. But we see this happening to Hannah. We see this happening to Hannah that in fact it seems like that it's God. It's, what is God doing in this account with Hannah? What's God doing? The first thing we notice there is that God closes her womb. Is that it seems like that it's God that is causing this pain with Hannah. Or is it that God is trying to get her attention? Because up until this point, we find that there are two voices from the first 8 verses of chapter 1, where Hannah is now introduced, that there are two voices, and two voices is not Hannah's voice, and that now it seems like that when God is going to do something new, when God is going to do something fresh, is that sometimes it doesn't get the attention it deserves, because in so many ways we can be so focused on things that we see, things that we want, and maybe at the time it was very similar. And so here we find Hannah comes onto the scene. She seems like a very broken woman. And then the two voices that we find here, and I thought it's quite interesting. In fact, Timothy Keller makes this point. He makes a point that it was at this time that we hear two voices. One was from Peninnah, which was her husband's other wife. And again, I won't reiterate it again, but we see this polygamy happening in the book of Samuel right in the beginning with Hannah. Does God allow polygamy, which is multiple wives or husbands? No, it was never part of God's plan. It was never part of God's plan. God gave us his plan right in the beginning. So this was not part of God's plan. So one, we hear the voice of her husband's other wife, which Timothy Keller says this was the voice of her society. This was the voice of her culture, telling her that because you don't have any children, you are a social reject. Because you don't have any children, we don't accept you. I think an interesting point. The second voice was a voice of her husband. Two voices. We haven't heard Hannah's voice yet. The second voice was the voice of her husband to accept her, for her to accept her husband in this kind of way, which Timothy Keller says that these two voices that it's introduced in the book of Samuel says whichever one she chooses, Hannah, whichever voice that Hannah chooses, was the one that she was going to build her life around. I thought to myself, that's quite interesting. How often does our culture, being socially accepted, for us to be accepted, do we build our life around that? Or the second voice is that we build our life around a person. And Timothy Keller says, whichever voice that she chooses, she was going to build her identity around. She was going to build her life around. But it's interesting because we haven't seen any action from Hannah, but what Hannah decides to do, and we'll go to verse 9. There's an interesting part here. I just want to make a quick mention of verse 9. So now Hannah's got a choice. Which voice is she going to listen to? Because the one that she chooses is the one that she will build her life around. Finally, Hannah comes onto the scene in verses 9. In verses 9, and I think I've got that up there somewhere. I think it also depends on which translation you read. The translation that I wanted to use was the, I'll just get that up right now. Sorry, folks. Because, verse 9. Once, when they had finished eating, I think I've changed my translation to the one that you might have up on the screen. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, it says Hannah stood up. Thank you. It says Hannah stood up. And Robert Alter, that's his name, he's a Hebrew scholar. He says, why would in the book of Samuel, or in this particular verse, that it would say that she stood up? I mean, was it necessary to say that she stood up? So in fact, Robert Alter says that Hannah, when it says that Hannah stood up, it was like an idiom. If I got that right, an idiom. It's almost like a metaphor, I think, what he was saying. Because it's like if I had said, I'm just pulling your leg. I'm not really doing it literally, but it sort of means something else. And so when it says Hannah stood up in verse 9, what it's referring to when Hannah stood up was that finally Hannah put her foot down. That's what it is. Hannah now decides she's going to take action. That's what it was. So she doesn't accept the voice of social acceptance. She doesn't choose the voice of building her life and her identity around a person or a thing, but she chooses in her prayer. This is what we're focusing on this morning in her prayer in verse 11. 1 Samuel 1 and verses 11. And this is what Hannah decides to do. She decides to do this. In verse 9, she says, and she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. No razor will ever be used on his head. Now, I'll go to that last part first. No razor will ever be used on his head this was the Nazirite vow. Now, you remember, also in the book of Judges, one of the last judge was Samson. And maybe you're familiar with the account of Samson. Samson also had committed, or his parents did, committed him to the Nazirite vow. And the Nazirite vow there were 4 things in the Nazirite vow. What was a Nazirite? Well, you remember the Levites, they're from the tribe of Levi. They were set aside. They didn't have any inheritance. They didn't have any land, where every other tribe in Israel did, except for the Levites. They were committed to the work of the temple. And priests and high priests from Aaron's descendants. And so those were the Levites. They were separated for the use of the temple. The Nazirite was a voluntary Levite, and they would assist and do the work, be assisting the Levites in their work at the temple, but they were voluntary. And so the Nazirite vow, there were 4 things. 1, you were separated apart to God. Number 2, that no razor would be used on the head. 3, they were to be abstain from alcohol. And 4, no contact with the carcass. There were 4, and these are in the book of Numbers. I haven't put the reference there. Numbers chapter 6. The Nazirite vow. So Hannah prays, and in her prayer, in Hannah's anguish, which I won't touch on, we touched on last week, in Hannah's prayer, finally she takes action. What's the action that she chooses? She doesn't choose those two voices, but she chooses to take action. She chooses, and here we get the picture. When everyone else is doing what's right in their own eyes, Hannah chooses a totally different action. It seems like she's choosing to build her identity around something that will last, to build her identity around and her grounding in God, in the Lord her God. And in that verse, in verse 11, we get that picture. We get that picture. Instead of her camping in bitterness and blaming God, in her beautiful prayer, she prays such a selfless prayer. She's pleading with God and to give her a son. And then she says that when she receives, that if God was to answer her prayer for a son, that she would give her son back to the Lord. And she would return her son into God's service. And so again, it might sound very straightforward reading it just in that chapter, but we put that onto the background when everyone else is doing what's right in their own eyes. Hannah is doing something very different to what everyone else of her time would have been doing. You just think about it. What is Hannah giving up? What's she giving up by returning her son back to God? This is in her prayer. This is the vow that she's making. She's saying, God, if you grant me with a son, with a child, I will take my son to Avondale, take him into your service. What's she missing out on? Well, one, your son was your security. He was to take the inheritance in your family. Another one, just the other day, I was doing some cleaning of our archives, and I came across a whole bunch of my kids' drawings and paintings from when they were in grade. Whanga just kept all of the stuff, and I was about to toss. I didn't have a good look. I was about to toss it out, and Whanga said, "Oh no, we want to keep that." And when I looked back through it, there's pictures of the kids had drawn pictures of the family, me, Whanga, and the kids, and I thought to myself, wow, Hannah is missing out. She's choosing to miss out on all the hugs and kisses and everything else that comes with having a child. But she makes a vow. There's also a part here after she prays. So I'll move after she prays. She prays to God, and that's why I haven't got this up here. Verse 18. In verses 18, it says this. Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman, which was Hannah, after she prays, she went her way. Her prayer hasn't been answered yet, and her face was no longer downcast. I've forgotten that one. Her face was no longer downcast. So she prays, then another translation is that she finds peace, and then her prayer is answered. So she prays, she finds peace, and then her prayer is answered. So she prays, she hasn't got what she prayed for yet, but she has peace, and then her prayer is answered. And it made me think, there was a time when I was at Avondale College, in my, I think, third year, I had, struggling to pay my fees, my tuition fees, and I had a few letters in the mail from the accountant, and warning me that if I don't come up with the money, I've only got 2 more weeks at college, and then I have to leave. I have to go and get a job. I did work a little bit, but because the load got a bit heavy, I thought, look, I better not work, but I'll just do what I can. So I kept praying and praying and praying, and then I heard of a scholarship at Avondale. So it's just like a scholarship was funding that you could apply for, but there was a scholarship fund. So I thought, okay, I'll pray. Gave it to the Lord. I went and applied for the scholarship. And then, so pray. So Hannah's one was pray, peace, and then answer was prayed. For me, it was opposite. I prayed. Did I have peace? No, I was stressing out. I was like, oh Lord, am I going to get it or not? I'm going to get kicked out of Avondale. Oh, no, what am I going to do? And that was probably, I remember that because it's probably one of the most stressful times in my life. And to get the scholarship, I remember at the time, there was like maybe 25 of us that applied for it. There's only 4 scholarships that they'll give. Out of 25 people, they'll only give 4. And so I was praying, gave it, and then I was fasting and praying. I had never done that for such a long time. I really gave it to God because I thought, God, if you really want me here, you got to give me a sign. So I was praying. I didn't have peace. I was stressing out bad. And then I remember in the beginning of that, so I applied for the end of that final, my 3rd year. Beginning of my 4th year, week 1, we have our first, back then it was like, I forget what they call it, it's like an assembly or a big worship service we had together. And then I knew at that was a week 1. On week 2, they were going to boot me out. I was gone. So week 1, they had this big assembly, and all the Avondale students came together, and I'm sitting inside Avondale College Church, and then they were going to announce the recipients of the scholarship. And so, the first guy was whoever it was, second guy, third guy, and I thought, oh Lord, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to leave. And then the last name was me. I couldn't believe it. Last name was mine. And finally, I had peace. If you follow what I'm saying, Hannah, as soon as she prayed, we find in verse 18 that her face was no longer a downcast. Hannah had peace immediately. And then she waited for God to bring an answer to her prayer. I wonder how we can apply that today. How can we apply that prayer of Hannah today? What is God saying to us today? What's God saying to you and me today? Maybe there are things on your prayer list. Maybe there are, as I mentioned earlier, with God closing her womb. What's God closed in your life? What are some things that you have been praying for? Now, this might be a very touchy subject for many of us, or for some of you sitting at home and listening and viewing. What are some things that maybe is God trying to get your attention or my attention? Are there things that deserves God's attention that God is attempting to do? Is God trying to do something new to you and me? Have you felt like maybe in Hannah's time that she would have felt isolated? In Hannah's time, she would have felt like this total reject. Everyone else was having children except for her. Everyone else was being accepted except for her. Maybe she would have felt stuck in the corner and isolated. But in Hannah's prayer, we find we find something very special. And it seems to me that maybe in her prayer, that God was working more on her. That maybe God was working more on Hannah's heart. Maybe God is working more on your heart and my heart. Maybe God is He's aligning you and me. Maybe God is trying to get the attention that He deserves. Maybe God is building a relationship with you and God and make that a priority in our lives for you and me. I want to finish on this other prayer, and it's the song of Hannah, but it's also the prayer of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. 1 Samuel chapter 2. We find this is Hannah's victory prayer. And I want you to notice something here, family. Notice something here. So now that Hannah has a few more other children. And Hannah has she has a victory song and a prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And says these words, that's right. I want you to notice a pattern with Hannah's prayer. The bows of the mighty are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. The Lord makes the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the ash heap. 1 Samuel 2, verses 1 to 10. So I want you to notice this pattern in Hannah's prayer. The Lord makes the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. For no strength shall man prevail. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Exalt the horn of his anointed. And if you notice of Hannah's prayer, there's a pattern there. There's a pattern with the prayer of Hannah. And I wonder if you notice that pattern. And that pattern seems to go something like this. That if you notice, God doesn't work through strength, but God works through weakness. That when you're down to nothing, pray. That it seems like that maybe when we're down to nothing, maybe is that when God's got you right where He wants you. Maybe that's where God's got you right where He wants you. If you notice that the prayer of Hannah, it's not the strong, but it's the weak. Now fast forward thousands of years later, there's another victory song, and this victory song is a song of Mary. And did you know that Mary adapted her prayer from Hannah's prayer? Mary, the mother of Jesus, echoes the prayer of Hannah. Because thousands of years after Hannah, there is another mother, and she has a child. And Mary has, and if you notice, this is Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1 and verses 46 to 55. I've just pulled some things out. And this is, I want you to notice, if you notice the same pattern in Mary's prayer. And Mary says, "For He has regarded the lowly state of His maidservant. He has scattered the proud in the imaginations of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich He has sent away empty." And if you notice, the pattern in Mary's prayer is very much the same as Hannah's prayer, because Mary adapted her prayer from the prayer of Hannah. And if you notice, the pattern was that God exalts the lowly. God uses the humble and the lowly and uses them. And doesn't that make sense? The disciples, were they the rich and famous? No. They were the lowly. They were the uneducated, and they were used. We think of Christ. Did He come in a high and lofty? Well, He came as the Almighty. He was the Almighty, but the way He introduced Himself, He came as the lowly. He came as the humble. And no wonder why we are reminded, and Paul says, "For that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And Corinthians also says, "God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are." Isn't that wonderful? That's one of my favorite quotes. Desire of Ages says that the King of Kings, he became a servant and a slave. So that us servants can become kings one day, because Jesus, He is the King of Kings and He is the Lord of Lords. And the reason why He came just for you and just for me. And maybe, just maybe, there are things that's on your prayer list. Maybe, just maybe, you might have lost your way. There is a King of Kings. He came, He's the Almighty. He came to a lowly place just to seek you. I'm wondering if you want to sing together with our worship team today as they sing these words, and maybe you are praying the same prayer, and the words of this song say this. Say, Lord, I'm coming home. Lord, I'm coming home. I invite our singers, if they could end off our worship service in a beautiful hymn.